Have you learned nothing in this class?
Not really.
Great. That makes me feel great as a professor.
I was joking, by the way.
I know. You know, it's really funny. I videotaped one of the other classes with an old projector, and it sees everything on the screen beautifully. Like you can, my phone will pick up all that stuff. This is a brand new fancy projector, and then all it sees when the camera is looking at it is just a giant bright white light. Okay, rebuttals are 2 minutes in length. You can say pretty much whatever you want, with the exception of you can't bring in brand new reasons, brand new claims, or brand new evidence that hasn't at least been introduced. Now, I'll be the judge of whether any of those things happen, so if you hear me say strike that or move on, do exactly that. Go to the next thing you wanted to say. Each person gets 2 minutes to do their rebuttal, up to 2 minutes, I should say. We start with the negative, so the affirmative gets the last word. That means, Gonzalo, you are up first. You get 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'm asking to reject this proposition. The U.S. should remain using combat drones. Combat drones are a lot cheaper than fighter jets, and combat drones kill less civilians when they attack because they have the ability to monitor targets and to make sure that it's the target that needs to be eliminated. And also, they can also make sure if civilians are not present before the attack is launched. In our opponent's evidence, it failed to have credibility. A real estate correspondent is not a professional in this topic, therefore the proposition should be rejected. Another thing, in one of their articles written by Tommy, and the article was called The Hidden Cost of Drone Combat, the article was written by a student. That student, I don't know about you guys, but the student is not very credible. He is not a professional in this topic. Thank you, I relinquish my time.
Okay, so Ted, you get 2 minutes as well.
Okay, like our opponent was saying, the drones are very precise, but these drones do not have anti-air defenses. So, you know, if there's other F-35s up there taking out the drones, you know, they're losing drones left and right.
Move on, that's a new reason.
Okay, I'm sorry. But in regards to the accountability too, is, you know, the responsibility when these drones are taking out civilians, nobody can be accountable for that. As Emily's or negative, you know, they're being watched by another person to pull that trigger. So, you know, how much paperwork is getting fumbled around, so nobody can take accountability for these deaths. And the majority of these drone strikes that are carried out in the civilians, you know, we were talking about them because nobody can be accountable for that. And I relinquish my time.
Final word from the negative. Emily, you get 2 minutes.
So I wanted to do a little different spin on this. Any way you paint it, war is terrible, lives are lost, survivors are scarred, families are broken, and the effects are endless. Although I've never been more near a war than when the country was struck by 9/11, I still feel the ripples of war in my life. I understand a little bit about loss that so many endure. You see, in September of 1944, toward the end of World War II, my grandfather was stationed in France with the 80th Infantry when he lost his life defending our country. Because of this, my father, who was just 2 months old, never knew his father. And my grandmother was left to care for her 2 young sons the rest of her life. I've never had the honor of knowing my grandfather. What stands between terrorists, tyrants, and the evil of our world and the freedom of our safety is technology. We must be at the forefront of technology when it comes to war. Technology saves lives. Drones save lives. I remind you, this is not a debate about if we should use military force against our enemies. This is a debate about whether we should use the most sophisticated technology, unmanned drones, when force is determined to be necessary. Once deadly force is deemed to be necessary and drone bombings are determined to be an effective means for a particular attack, doesn't it make sense that the ground troops be kept out of harm's way? Isn't it logical that flying pilots use these missions to return safely to their families rather than being placed in danger of being shot down, held as hostages, or worse, killed? Why would we choose to put others through this misery? I respectfully request that you reject this proposition and banning the use of combat drones during combat. That's my time.
Okay, one more rebuttal. From the affirmative. Modesto, you get 2 minutes.
Alright. Like my opponent was stating about her family, I mean, what she's mostly using right there just seems to be more of an appeal to emotion than anything else. But they also state that drones, they use precision and they're, really sophisticated. I mean, in an incident in where, 46 innocent people were killed and only 4 of them were related to the Taliban, does that really seem like precision, the simple fact that they're even stalking the enemy? And they have the ability to, know if a civilian is there. I mean, that doesn't really sound like precision to me. And also, will it make drones, will drones actually make soldiers safer? I mean, keep in mind that PTSD is the overall killer of, soldiers in the United States. A lot of soldiers and veterans, they commit suicide every day, compared to actual combat fatalities. So, drones, they don't necessarily make soldiers or drone pilots any safer. And they also, keep in mind that fighting the war on terrorism relies a lot on actual personal communication with the locals. I was reading a book a long time ago, Combat Outpost Keating, which is a personal account from 3 Tech 71 Cavalry Unit, and they mentioned the emphasis on personal communication and human-to-human interaction, which is done by soldiers, which is effective in building trust and relations with the locals. Like I said, you need to collect information to simply capture terrorists. Drones cannot do that. And keeping up with other countries, building an arsenal of drones. I mean, that sounds a lot like the Cold War, how we were going at it with Russia, just building up nuclear warheads when in reality we never even used them. So we're just gonna follow this popular trend and just keep on building drones and drone after drone, just like China. I mean, how much is that gonna cost? And that's, keep in mind, it's gonna be a bigger burden on taxpayers, especially taxpayers like me and you. So, I relinquish my time.
Okay, give a round of applause, shake your opponent's hand. Debate topic not equal. Somebody asked me in the intermission, has anybody ever gotten a fight after debate? I said, yeah, actually, unfortunately. And then right before you walked in, Jesus said, hey, it's not a good debate unless they're, what'd you say?
Unless it gets physical.
Unless it gets physical, which I totally disagree with.
Don't say you disagree.
Jordan, is the screen still on? Can you see it from there?
Yeah.
Can you see me? I want them to get some of my comments. There's my head being chopped off.
Yeah. Your head's not chopped off. Like.
You see about here up?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. I have no idea what it's catching. Okay. So you guys that are doing the debate, just like before, leave your flow sheets, put your name on them, leave them on the table. I think I have one for you guys already, but if you have a revised outline and more excited, I need that. And then everything else you guys take with you. Okay. So let's go ahead and share a vote here. The proposition reads that the U.S. should ban the use of combat drones in combat zones. That's what it should say. Anyways, how many of you vote in favor of the affirmative? Okay. 3 people, all right. That's an improvement. Okay, but that's not laughing, but it's an improvement. How many think the negative maintains the status quo? Okay. And for what it's worth, now you guys can't see on the video, 3 people voted in favor of the affirmative, about 10 voted in the negatives case. But what I wanted to share with the group is I did ask in the intermission how many of you already felt relatively strongly that we should keep drones in military striking forms. And a lot of those people said that yes. So not only were you fighting against an actual status quo for debate purposes, but it seemed as if there was at least some majority who already thought they were a good idea. But remember, guys, they didn't get to hear any of the comments we made in the intermission, and there might have been new things, but who would like to share a reason why they voted for one side or another? Well, Augustine, first of all, let me ask Augustine, and then who was the other person, Lisa? They changed sides, right? Or at least they identified a side. So one of you two, give me a reason why you think the affirmative overcame the burden of proof.
I think what Modesto said at the end, that we're making the drones
people is making a massive war instead of one man, one war. It's making more about like what happened in Russia, you know. I'll make a bigger bomb, and it'll become worse.
So that you like the analogy that you did, Gerard, it's not necessarily making it less concise, just adding another layer, making it bigger and bigger.
Because other
Okay.
countries are gonna make more drones, and they're gonna come here.
Okay, all right.
Emily pointed out in her argument earlier that the pilots, they can actually stretch the legs and basically relax a lot more. And I don't know if I can trust the fact that drones are being piloted by people who can just relax on their job, and if they feel like there's a threat, they can just press a button and kill someone when they're not paying fully attention. It's like if they can relax and still talk to their family while they're on the job or something.
So even though the decision is made by them, it's still other people in an office somewhere with their conditioning and perhaps not 100% attention.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, that's a reasonable example. All right, Jose, you have been the one person, now that Modestus is next to you, I'm like, maybe it was because he's your buddy, I don't know. But no, give me a reason. Why do you think that the affirmative overcame the burden of proof? Maybe it was the same reason you said before, maybe it was something new.
Well, here's something new, because it says, you have to have personal communication with the locals to collect data. That's, how you're gonna find out a lot more stuff of where people are hiding, because, sometimes there's civilians that don't agree with the dictators or whatever, and, they wanna make sure they get killed.
Okay, so that notion of getting more of that information that the drone, which is a destruction device, doesn't do as well. We were talking about destruction drones. Okay. Okay, most of you still voted for the affirmative, though, so give me a reason why. Yeah, Jesus.
The reason why, well, first of all, was against the banning for the U.S. drones.
Okay.
But after hearing Emily's and Gonzalo's strong arguments, I think that what made the difference is that they made really strong arguments in which their opponents kind of failed to capitalize. Like, how I mentioned that they didn't go back about the comparison of $5 to $14 million of what it costs to make a drone versus 45,000. I think that one of their arguments that they said is that drones is a cheaper form. If they would have just mentioned that back, it would have put them in a position where they had to justify as to why it was cheaper.
They both talked about money, but more talk was about the money the way the negative wanted you to see it.
Yeah.
And so what was brought up in the intermission that you guys didn't hear us say was that you guys, most people in the room thought that once the negative started talking about the cost in the way you wanted to talk about it, those numbers and explanation and talking about sources seemed to favor your side. However, Jesus brought up, he goes, but wait a minute, don't you remember the affirmative said right at the beginning about it's, X number of $1 million to make a drone, but it's only about $45,000 to train a soldier. And so there are different ways to talk about costs, right? And so he thought it would be a good idea to come back to that. And I thought that was a good idea. Reaffirm the areas of cost, because there's lots of levels that make it harder to just say, oh, well, obviously the building cost here is this and the building cost here is that, so therefore it's less. But that didn't go back to it. And so as a result, in the debate, there was a lot more discussion about cost in a way that favored the negative. And I think that's true. Another area, just since we're talking about cost, that I would have suggested, it's hard to anticipate exactly what the negative would say, but I think you probably anticipated that maybe money was going to come up, right? Because it's technology, it costs money. Okay. The negative seemed to imply that if we use drones, we are going to use fewer jets. That was a very direct comparison. But what evidence do we have that they have started using fewer jets? They didn't provide any of that evidence. So are they actually using and producing and buying less jets? Or are we using and producing the same number of jets and then we've just added the next layer of drones? Because if that's the case, then we're not saving any money at all. We're actually costing ourselves more money. And so that would be a question that, in a larger scale, if this comes to a real votable type of a thing, that we would want to look into, right? Especially since the United States military is fairly well funded. A very big chunk of our money goes to it. In fact, most of our federal taxes go to it. So I don't think it's totally unreasonable to think that maybe it's just another added layer, right? So I would have pushed on that a bit. You guys keep saying we're saving all this money, All we can say is these cost this much. I have not come across any evidence, unless you guys have, that shows that we've traded it, right? We've retired these jets in favor of these drones. We've retired this program of training 500 pilots a year for physical aircraft, and now we're only training 100 drone pilots a year. you know, prove that to me, because otherwise, all we know is there's an added expense. Does that make sense? Neither side talked about it, but I think it's a good avenue where another cost argument could come in. Okay, anybody else have any other comments you'd like to make or questions? Okay. Did the affirmative establish that there are harms that are increased or being caused by the drone project? What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was the harm you think that they established that we should consider, that we need to think about, maybe that you hadn't thought about before?
They give the example about how a drone was used in order to supposedly kill so-called terrorists, in which only 4 of them were terrorists and the other 45 were civilians. So that shows a flaw that even drones aren't that precise.
Yes, it definitely will challenge the notion, which I thought the negative brought up, that, hey, they brought up one of them that comes to mind is the UN quote that I think Gonzalo was the one that cited, about how generally speaking, there were less in this one given year, civilian casualties, right? I would argue, what were the other things? How many missions did we have in that year? That would be another variable to consider. But nonetheless, they presented it, and I think that as it was presented, the notion was that civilian casualties generally are going to go down, because, or have gone down because of the use of drones. But the example that the affirmative brought up is that they're not perfect. So this idea that you're taking all the emotion and all the air out of it is just not true. I mean, they didn't challenge the idea. They challenged the credibility, but they didn't challenge the example that, okay, we think there's these Taliban leaders or other group of terrorists, and we killed 50 of them, and we got 4 that were linked to Taliban. Not necessarily were even active members or leaders of Taliban, but only linked, and the negative didn't challenge that. So anyways, they certainly did highlight that they're not perfect, right? Okay, anything else that the affirmative you think did establish as a harm of the current system or moving forward could be a harm? Augustine, you identified a harm. What was the thing you said?
Drones will make more of a bloody war, and you will say will look bad.
Okay, to kind of paraphrase what you said a little bit earlier, you said you liked what Modesto said at the end, that the notion that more of these countries want them, they might get them, it might turn more into a Cold War. You didn't say it this way, but basically what it sounded like you were implying, and Modesto, was that war is going to get easier to become more impersonal. Not that there aren't ways to do that with big giant missiles already, but it's just another layer of making it less personal and easier to disconnect, and potentially into that kind of slippery slope where it could get out of hand. Not absolute, but it's certainly implied a possibility. It's easier now. All right. How did I vote? This is a tough one because, first of all, let me say, the votes were pretty conclusive that you guys thought the affirmative overpowered the negative overpowered the affirmative quite substantially. I don't think it was that substantial in terms of what we saw both sides present. The questions that were asked, the data that was offered, the elaborations. I did side with the negative as well, but primarily because it seemed to me the argument on cost as presented favored the negative. And the arguments on civilian casualties was unclear, right? I mean, there's parts of me when I was hearing you guys talk, and I wanted to favor the negative, and there's parts of me that said, no, I'm favoring the affirmative, but the problem is that was unclear. And I probably would have been still okay siding with the negative, because remember, I want to overcome that burden to prove just on cost alone. But when I didn't have an exact offering of a plan, like what we should do instead, or how we should phase them out, or how we could maximize, maybe increase the money spent on the surveillance drones, otherwise, because I didn't know what our next step would be, was what really sealed it for me. But I do want to say that I think all 4 of you, and no offense to the 2 debates that have gone so far, understood your material and recognized weaknesses and questions better than anybody else has so far. So even though the votes weren't as even as maybe one of the last 2 debates, I think your guys' preparation and knowledge of your material was better as a group than anybody else yet. So that's kudos to all 4 of you. Did you guys have any questions? Emily said she wants to go and argue about drones in every class she ever takes.
Oh my gosh, no. I hate doing this.
I just wanted to make the comparison to Ender's Game, because this sounds a lot like Ender's Game. Because what Ender's Game was all about was Ender was raised from a child to become basically a commander to lead a fleet against the bugs, the aliens. But he didn't know, because the way they were training him they take him from the command school they take him to outer space to go train, and then they take him to this commander position to train as a commander to command a fleet. But what he didn't know is what he was actually fighting the entire time, the real war. But they trained him as if it were just training sessions.
Like a game?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, right, so they didn't know reality versus the game. Okay, cool.